We are students of the art of play,
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
a show for the players who ask why.
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
Hey Gaia, what are we talking about today?
So, for today's episode, I want to kind of talk about the last season. So, in our last season of this show, we've talked a lot about game design principles that are often forgotten from the player's perspective when discussing games. We discussed concepts like building your stories and your world building through things other than direct text or direct narration. We talked about depth versus complexity, and we talked about session zeros in TTRPGs. But one big thing that we've lacked through this entire time is a professional to talk to kind of tell us about game design as well. Mm-hmm. And that's partially because this show has always been focused on the player's perspective, but it always helps to know and to get confirmation from someone who knows what they're saying within the field and has significant work in the field, not just playing games, but working with building these types of games. So, with this, I would like to introduce our guest for the show, or give you the opportunity to introduce yourself.
Okay, cool. I'm Scott Bateman. I'm an associate professor in computer science at the University of New Brunswick. I direct the Human-Computer Interaction Lab, co-direct that with my colleague Daniel Ray, and I also direct a research center called Spectral, which is UNB's spatial computing research lab.
Perfect. So for today's episode, we're going to be having a conversation with Scott Bateman here about many of these completely lost my train of thought. We're going to have a conversation with Scott Bateman here about what it's like researching game design and what it's like being from that academic perspective within creating games, within human-computer interaction and game design principles. Sound good, Vi?
Yes, it does.
You're leaning away from the mic.
As I'm going to take a sip of my drink.
So to kind of open up the conversation and begin talking about game design and research within game design, would you be able to tell us a bit about your research and about your experiences as a researcher in academia for game design?
Yeah, okay, so I'll start maybe talking a little bit about human-computer interaction and what that sort of research field looks like, which is really hard because it's a super huge field and it's really, really broad. Typically, when we think of human-computer interaction, we're probably thinking of people doing interface design and layout. But as a research discipline, we really focus a lot more on what future technology looks like and how should we be designing that technology. In other words, what are the features, what are the things that are in that technology that it should have to make it, effective. And effective could be, it's faster, easier, I make fewer errors when I use it, but it could also be, I enjoy it more, right? It's easier to learn, it's fun, right? And those are all those criteria could be things that are important from sort of when you're thinking about putting technology into the real world. And so human-computer interaction really has this focus of imagining what it's like to put things into the real world. And so we tend to build systems or study existing systems to understand what does it mean to have those systems in the real world, and how could they be improved in the future, and always trying to build things so that we're more conscious of what people value in technical systems. So that's human-computer interaction. And so I've been working in human-computer interaction. I started my master's degree in 2005, which is a ways ago now. And I did my master's and PhD at the University of Saskatchewan, where it so happens that although Saskatchewan is, maybe not the most prestigious school in the world, it so happens that I lucked into the fact that they just have this amazing human-computer interaction research group there that's really world-leading. And, I've done a lot of pioneering work over the past almost 25 years or so. And so it was a really great environment, not only to learn about human-computer interaction and technology and how we can use it, but also to become connected with this sort of global community of researchers that work in human-computer interaction. And during that time, one of the things that I started working on as a PhD student was studying game design and studying HCI in a game design context. and that sort of grew at that time, and more researchers were becoming interested in studying games and game design at that time. So this started around kind of 2007, 2008 or so, and it's really grown since then. And now games are really a big part of, or recognizing games in play are really a big part of what is studied in human-computer interaction research.
Cool. So that gives a good kind of overall summary of what you do with HCI Lab, your history in it, and why it matters to some people. But I would like to kind of follow up on that with a quick question as well. So in doing research in human-computer interaction, what does an experiment or research in this field look like? Like how do you build an experiment? How do you study human-computer interaction?
So that's a really great question, and is a really, really hard one to answer. There's lots of different things that you could use to sort of take to it. Sometimes we have people, and I have a lot of people come to me and say, hey, I want to study, or I want to understand this thing, or we'd like to build something, right? Can you help us build it? And oftentimes, I most of the time say, especially if somebody comes to me and says, hey, would you build this thing for me? Most of the time I'll say no, because, it's not what I do, right? I study things, but a lot of the time, surprising, number of times out of that, I get people come and sort of propose something quite new and quite interesting. And that's one way that we sort of pick research projects, right? So if you have sort of a knowledge of human-computer interaction and what really, in any academic discipline, we're really trying to do something that's quite nebulous, which is do things that are interesting. And things that are interesting are things that are maybe unknown, or we don't know, or is kind of like a hot topic that people are kind of thinking about. And really your audience for that work is, although in human-computer interaction we're quite broad, and some of our work does get picked up in the media, it really doesn't for the most part, right? A very small percentage actually gets, to the broader public. And so for the most part, our audiences are other researchers, and trying to, push ahead our understanding and knowledge and sort of things. I will say, though, there's a really great exception to that, which has really attracted me to studying games. Our game designers are so academic in their knowledge, right? They are really looking at other things. So if you talk to a game designer, although they don't often reach out to us, because the game development design world is quite insular in that they hold, especially for big companies, right? They hold things quite close to their chest. So they often, but if I can trap them and have a conversation with them, and I have a lot of graduate students that I studied with, and some of my own graduate students have gone into work in the games industry. So those are the people that I can sort of feel comfortable trapping and say, hey, what about this and this? And you kind of they start to reveal how much knowledge they have about the things that we're doing. I think I got sidetracked a little bit there on the question, but the question was about how do we pick things to design, right? So, or to study. And so that's one way, is people coming to us, right? And I would say the other thing is that it is really interest driven from our own side of things a lot of the times too. So we encounter things that, that we think are sort of interesting problems that are maybe even real world problems. And so to give you an example of that, I can talk about the very first sort of game design topic that I studied. And this happened, I started this project probably around 2009 or 2010 or something like that. At the time, the Nintendo Wii was, out and quite prominent.
was the device to have. Yeah.
We just had a conversation about this in our last episode.
Yeah, we did a
Nintendo Wii was like dominant for a while.
Yeah. And it was dominant because everybody was super excited about how accessible it was, right? Because no longer did you have to have, anybody could play, because we had motion controls, right? And the motion controls were sufficiently good, like by pointing and clicking, right, is all you really had to know, or swinging your hand left or right. It's all you had to do to be able to engage in the game, right? And so that would allowed a lot of other people to access the game. So you didn't have to know complex,
Yeah, we talked about our depth versus complexity episodes, how easy are things to pick up at the beginning of games or even at the beginning of learning consoles.
Yep.
And then when we spoke about the Nintendo Wii, that was the thing that we really hit upon. It was like, it was a lot of people's first device, because even if your parents weren't gamers, like my dad had a PS1 that was in the house, but like the first thing I learned how to control was like the Nintendo Wii and then the Nintendo DS.
Right.
Because those learning curves were so easy and so accessible.
There's so much more accessible to the learning curve, and even something about that, people seeing that and saying, "Oh, I can do that," right? And the other part of it was, also people, that sort of has a snowball effect too. I think you see other people that are like you now playing those video games, right? Rather than always the same sort of demographic playing video games, right? So it makes it, and this expands to people that, maybe were, older adults, right? So we had a lot of fun playing, tennis on the Wii with, my wife and my parents, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And, I remember at the time, for example, they would get so sort of immersed in it that, people were hitting each other with the nunchuck, right?
Yeah,
but it's also something we talked about.
Yeah.
So going back to this sort of first research project and how I ended up sort of thinking it was an interesting thing to study was I had gotten a Wii because I thought, well, geez, this is gonna be great. Now my wife, who doesn't had played Nintendo when she was a kid, and we had both had Nintendos, like the original Nintendo. But, she wasn't really interested in games. But, when I brought up the Wii, she said, "Oh yeah, I'd like to try that." I said, "Okay, right, finally, right? She's going to play video games. We can spend time around this. I'm going to be able to play more video games," which is most people's goals, or should be their goal in life.
Yeah.
And, we'll be able to bring this in the house, and, because it's accessible, she'll have fun, right? Now, the thing that was about that is that we did have fun for a while, right? But at some point, these games are, especially if you're playing with each other, they're, a lot of the games are competitive games. And one of the games that we liked is that there's a little mini game like We Play or something, I think it was called. It was just a bunch of little mini games. And there was one in particular that really kind of got me thinking about this. It was just a target shooting game, right? It was just targets. It was kind of like Duck Hunt. But you just pointed the controller and you just sort of shot as many targets as you could, as quickly as you could. And at first we were having a lot of fun with this, but at some point, right, it's like, okay, this game's all about competition. In order for me to have a fun experience, I've got to try, right? And I'm just going to sandbag it so that she feels good about herself all the time, right? And so why is there, and I'm not saying that my wife is, not good at video games, but it's just she doesn't have the thousands of hours invested in hand-eye coordination that I have from my longer experience sticking with, I had the Super Nintendo, right? Then I had PC games, right? I had, all this stuff. And so she, understandably, she just, couldn't keep up with me. And then, she started to say like, well, I never beat you anymore, right? Like it's not fun because, I can play, but it's not fun because I don't have a chance to win, right? And so that sort of having a chance to win is a really interesting thing. So the first project that I started looking at when I started looking at games was around, 2010 or so, 2011 was, how could we make this experience fun, right? So I took that game, I recreated it, and what we did was we actually used just a little sort of what we call target assistance, but this exists in a lot of games. Like, back then it was like Halo had this in, and I can talk about that a little bit, but, use just a little bit of aim assistance, right? So we could secretly, and I could secretly, without anybody knowing, sort of just nudge their cursor on the screen or their reticule on the screen towards the targets, right? And because you have this little bit of hand jitter with the Wii and you're pointing and this kind of fast moving, that little bit of accentuation is very imperceptible, but it has a big outcome, like a big, outcome on how people perform in the game. So I was able to build this game just to demonstrate how we could do this. And also we also able to show, so we did sort of a quantitative thing. It's like, okay, well, this really works, right? We can measure it and say, like, it really works, right? We can boost people's performance. We can make competition a lot tighter. And we were able to show, because we do something else, which is a lot more, one side is kind of quantitative, and we can do something a little bit more on not quantitative. What I'm looking for is objective measures of performance, right? The other side of it is a little bit more subjective, which is really important for human-computer interaction. Like, how does it make you feel? Right? What is the impact of that? And so we were able to show that people had more fun when the competition is closer, right? And so that was sort of like one of the first, research papers that we did, and we had a lot of success with that at that time, right? It won an award at the Kai conference, which is the biggest human-computer interaction conference in the world. So it was quite, nice to sort of have that work come out, and it really, that sort of launched me into my research in games and game design. But at the same time, it going back to the original question was, it was one of those times where, we picked a research problem that really came out of our own sort of experience, right? And I've always find that those are the best, in HCI, the best things, right? When you can relate to a problem, say, I want to solve that problem, and or I want to understand that problem, and how we can, make it better or fix that problem, is always kind of the most rewarding research directions to go in.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds great to hear that, like, the problems of entering the world of gaming when you don't have a background in it can be solved with, like, a field of research. I don't know why, but that's kind of reassuring in a lot of ways, of just like, okay, like, there are people working on it. It's okay. Yeah.
And that's what I love about human-computer interaction, because it is really sort of, problem-driven, right? The whole thing about HCI is that we, historically we've said, or at least we've had the attitude, the unspoken sort of rule is that, you don't go looking for how a particular technology can fix a problem, right? You're very problem and people focused, and you understand the situation, you understand a context, and then you let a technological solution present itself based on that, right? And that's how we try to make sure that an interactive system is going to be successful in a situation, right? Or something new that we're going to build, is because, we really try to understand people and their problems, rather than saying, oh, I've got this, technology and it can solve,
I've got this magic wand,
right,
and
exactly,
we'll fix
right?
it. Yeah.
And it's kind of, the other sort of analogy that's kind of well known is sort of like having a hammer, right? If you have a hammer, everything's a nail, right? What can I bang this, what is a nail that I can hit with this hammer, right? I know how to use hammers, I know everything about hammers, but, then everything becomes a nail, right? In some sense. And, that hammer may not be the best solution for everything, right? I don't push the button on your console here with my hammer, because I probably break it.
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
I'm going to use my finger because it's the best.
Yeah.
So as a bit of a follow-up about that, now that we have an understanding of what HCI research can look like, kind of your origins within the field of research, here's one question that might work better for our audience, especially in why should the average player care about HCI research, game design research in the academia standpoint? Because you always hear people talking about, here's this decision that Blizzard made, here's a decision that EA made, here's the new game from Steam. Why should players also care about academia?
Yeah. So I think that, academia, there's a few different things. The one that kind of jumps to mind, and I'll talk a little bit about this first, is sort of people's passion and interest in games as sort of media, right? And if you're sort of a movie buff, well then, you start watching movies and you understand more movies, and you start to get into, oh, look how they do this, cut to this scene, or how they do this transition, or how they did this dialogue, right? All that stuff I just mentioned exists in games because, right, there are storytelling is rich, right? And we draw on a lot of cinematic things to tell stories in video games. But it's just a sort of analogy to say, like, people do it in other things as well, and people do it very much in games, right? I really like how this thing works, right? And because you are part of a game, I think it's even more amplified, right? You are part of a game, right? When you play a game, you are in it, you are acting in the world. And so if something feels different or feels off or feels like it could be apparent, right? You have, you can say, like, oh, I wish I could do this in the game, right? And you want to talk about it, because, and even like other media, right, we spend way more time playing games than we do. Like a movie only lasts like 90 minutes. Maybe if you get a good Martin Scorsese, it's like 3 hours. But 3 hours, like to a gamer, that's like, wow,
That's the intro.
that's cute. Yeah, that's like, what are you doing, right? Like, you know, any game now, it's like, you know, can be hundreds of hours, right?
Yeah.
Looking at my Persona 5 playtime at 140 hours to finish the game.
Yeah, I don't want to brag, but my Breath of the Wild time is up in the 150s.
Well, that, and even if, and now if we start talking, we were talking about MOBAs just before you arrived, right? And MOBAs, like, we were doing some study on MOBAs and interviewing MOBA players and things like that, and it's like, you know, that was a badge of honor. Is like how many thousands, right? Thousands of hours, and not just like 1,000. Oh, that 1,000 is cute, right? Like you're just learning.
You're
how
just
to
starting.
Play. You're just starting out, right? It's like, you know, multiple thousands of hours in MOBAs, and this was like 10 years ago, right? And so now they've been when we were studying this, right? So now it's like, okay, how many? I would hate to go back and talk to some of these players and see how many thousands of players hours they actually have, right? And you know, I also know that they started making, as that number got higher, right? People start making other accounts, right? So that, you know, they can selectively show their hours, right? Because if you see like 10,000 hours, it's like, holy, right? That's
I can't find this old review anymore, but it reminds me of this review I saw on Skyrim on Steam that just said it's okay, and the playtime was 14,000 hours. Like significantly more than the requirement to become a master of something.
Exactly, right? And so people, you know, spend a significant portion of their waking lives, you know, playing some of these games, right?
There's a level of expertise and familiarity with particular games that doesn't happen in a lot of other realms. Like when you talk about movies, right? Like there are some cult, like, you know, classics that people are very, very familiar with, right? Like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Star Wars, all that sort of things. But you don't sort of spend the same kind of like integrated time with those systems. Yeah, I think you know, that's a really interesting point, right? I heard a comedian sort of saying that who was one of these U.S. politicians? He just wrote a book. Anyway, it doesn't matter who. One of those Republican guys. He said, you know, I've watched this movie like, you know, hundreds of times, and then this comedian's like, no, you haven't. Nobody watches a movie hundreds of times, right? Like you don't do it, but it's like video games. Yeah, it's like I turned that thing on hundreds of thousands of times, right? So where did we start with this conversation? I started talking about
kind of why the players should care about academia.
Oh, yeah. So what I was getting to was, as we can see, like even our conversation, right, is about like, you know, players have way more invested, right, in terms of time and experience with this media. And so, yeah, naturally they're going to talk about it more. Naturally they're going to share their ideas more. But the thing about, you know, game design and HCI is it really gives you those tools to understand, you know, why things might be the way they are right now and how they might actually be improved, right? And to say like, oh, you know, that's a really complex problem, right? How would we go about, you know, solving that problem, or how would we study it so we can even understand the problem, right? And the work in MOBAs that we were doing I was actually really interested in, you know, how people communicate in MOBAs because it's so friggin' fast, right? It's just, you watch these games, like, you know, if like at the time, the big thing was watching the international for Dota 2, right? And that was like, you know, I was like, there's a stadium of people watching people playing video games, and then there's millions and millions of dollars. Like the winning team gets like $20 million. So it's like, this is crazy on a scale I, you know, just seemed to emerge out of nowhere. And the thing about that was like, okay, you know, how do they communicate, right? Like, you know, having played sports growing up, and then, you know, playing video games, and, you know, I was doing a little bit of work in human computer interaction about how people can communicate and sort of their work tasks and how to make it really easy. I was like, oh, this is really cool, right? How do they, in this super high performance situation, you know, communicate? And so we started looking at, you know, the use of pings, which is a big mechanic in MOBAs, right? Like how do you know, just pinging the map, right? And Dota was interesting because unlike some other MOBAs, it only had at the time one type of ping, right? It was just like the ping was basically it. I don't think I'm misspeaking there. It might have a different thing, but basically everybody used the ping for everything. So it's like, okay, what are they using that ping for? And, you know, this just basically binary, like, you know, it's on, like, you know, and so how do they embed meaning into that? How do they infer what's going on there, right? And so this is just another example of, you know, sort of that rich sort of complexity that are in games. And so lots of people would say, oh yeah, they should, you know, add in more pings, right? This other game has like way to do like different types of pings, but it's like, okay, but you know, is that gonna, what would be the trade-offs there, right? We have to think about that very carefully, right? Everybody, you know, gets super mad when they buff or debuff, you know, one of the characters in a MOBA. Well, you know, this is even more fundamental, right? This is the way that you interact with the world, and you want to change something just willy-nilly, right? It's like, no, right? You got to think about this carefully because it could have really big implications for how that game works, right? And especially in these competitive situations, it may be even higher stakes, right? People are like, oh, I've invested thousands of hours and a lot of money, right? And
yeah, and you've put together sort of a method for how you communicate. If you add one more thing, it's like, okay, I had a set system that is ingrained that I just knew how to do, right? It's one of those things you no longer sort of consciously think about, that you just know how to do. And then if you add another step to it, like you've fundamentally changed how you use that system.
Yeah. So it becomes maybe harder, right? Or more complex, or, you know, maybe it actually allows you to communicate more easily. But now sometimes what we've seen before too is that people who have a lot of time invested in learning how to do something the old way, they get kind of pissed off because they're like, now you're going to make it too easy for all these newbies to come in.
Yeah.
I had to go the hard way, right? I went through the school of hard knocks, right? Now you're going to let anybody come in and just come in and be able to be as good as me without the investment.
Every discussion on Sid Meier's Civilization.
Yeah.
Literally every single one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, there's lots of examples. Anyway, so I think, you know, the just sort of an extended answer to your first question, right? Well, why should people care? Is like, well, you know, if you care about the media and you're invested in something, it does give you this rich set of tools and, you know, knowledge about how could we possibly go about answering these really complex questions, right? That are really complex. And so that's what, you know, human-computer interaction is really kind of all about, right? Is building up not just a knowledge of sort of game design, but actually like building theory around that so that we can explain it in new situations, right? How do we think this might work in this new situation and why, right? So
how have you seen, like, I know this is a step away from Guy's sort of scripted questions, but how have you seen the gaming community change in the years you've been working in the field? Like, are people more interested in those sort of minute details, or are they, where do you see the community's focus?
That's a really interesting question, and it's a hard one. And I think, you know, I could go lots of different ways with that. I think one way that I would kind of take it is that just as time has gone on, I really feel there's more of a sort of, and maybe this is just my own focus and interest, but there's more of a sort of democratization of who can participate in game design and create games, right? Like I look at something like itch.io, right? And how rich that website is and the amazing games that are on there. Like the games that I've played on itch.io that people have built with a tool, it's a little virtual console thing it's called. Anyways.
Oh, is that the Gaia, please, what is this called? The little yellow,
Sorry?
If we go on itch.io, we can find it. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head.
I'm like picturing it in my head.
It's what Celeste was built in, right? You know the game Celeste?
Yeah.
It's like a platformer where it's this super easy to pick up tool. It provides, you know, it was designed for a virtual console that doesn't really exist, right? But so it gives you some constraints about how you can build things, right? Just as sort of, it's kind of like got a retro game feel just because of the constraints it puts in it, right? Here's the palette you're going to use. You can only have like, you know, I can't remember how many lines, but it's like 4,000 lines of code in your game and these types of things, right? And, you know, you're only going to have a resolution of something really low, like can't remember, it was like 180 by 140 pixels or something, right? You know, it's really kind of low res. But the games that people have built in that game are so impressive, right? What they built in it. Like Celeste, for example, if you go and play the original Celeste on itch.io, you'll find that, you know, it's like this game is so tight, like the controls are so tight. It's just genius that somebody's put into there. And in that website, it's and particularly with this tool, it's meant for sort of remixing and learning and these types of things, right? So you can go and grab that game, and so now there's, people creating their own sort of, spin-offs or derivative works based on Celeste, and it's like, wow, that is just super, super cool, right? So it as sort of like the thing that I think is really interesting is the sort of the ability. And when you think as technology gets bigger and more complex and more rich, and the reality, the quality of graphics that we can now produce is like, wow, right? It's like you look at some of the latest AAA titles, and it's like, this is, unbelievable, right? Like what we are able to build and do in sort of a virtual world just for playing video games is so rich and amazing. But at the same time, we've seen sort of an equal progression in smaller shops, right? We were talking about Stardew Valley as an example, right? Effectively built by one person, right? And Celeste is like, 2 people, right? It's just like these games are so engaging and so rich. And I actually find myself spending more of my time rather on AAA titles than on these more like indie things, because they're, I don't know, there's something more pure about them, right? And that's what I like to engage with, these days when I play games.
So I did find the fantasy console. I think it's called the Pico 8.
Yes, Pico 8. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yes, Pico 8. And, I think everybody should check out Pico 8. It's super cool. The language that they use is Lua there, which is kind of a challenging little scripting language, but it's nice and kind of constrained in that environment. And again, you can go out and kind of look at these other examples that exist right on like itch.io and try out some games, and there's everything there. And it's very similar to the way Scratch was set up as well, right? If you're familiar with Scratch, it's often people's first experience with coding and coding games is Scratch, and it provided a purely sort of a purely like graphic based programming environment where you could take sort of blocks and you code them using blocks, you drag and drop, and then you can create games, and then you publish your game to a website, and then other people can come along and remix your games, right? It was sort of fundamentally a sort of a sharing of games sort of thing. So you build up there's a big community around it and people sharing things, and so that's often people's first experience. So it's kind of similar to that, but just sort of like, the next level of tool to get people. Has a sprite editor, has a music editor in it, right? So you can do basic music and sound effects and things like that. So it's really cool.
Yeah. We've talked about like I don't know how familiar you are with D&D at all, but
a little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
Fairly, yeah.
In the past couple of years, we've seen sort of a renaissance of D&D with 5th edition and podcasts and actual plays coming out. So the democratization of those like spaces is huge among gaming, whether it's tabletop RPG and video games. So I think it's just interesting that those two communities are mirrored, and I think it's because there's a lot of shared like people cross into both communities. As sort of the Venn diagram's kind of a circle.
Yeah. They have kind of a similar basis of like game design principles and how to approach a lot of problems.
Yeah, I think it's really cool that there's a space there that people are trying to make the things that they love successfully, right? Like I'm thinking about Stardew Valley being just one person being very passionate about a project and producing a really high quality piece of work.
One person who, when he began, didn't own a desk, and I will never stop bringing that up. He used his computer tower as a desk.
Yeah, that's good.
And I still hate the fact that he posted about that on Twitter after the game came out.
It's it's just such a good image of like, hey, I'm an independent studio. Not even. I'm one guy and I didn't have a desk. He
celebrated the game getting like 1 million sales by buying a desk. And it's not even a joke.
Oh my
I
goodness.
think that's what he posted about it.
Okay, so I thought you were going to say that like he bought a desk like, a little bit in, he got into the project and he was like,
sure
okay,
the game was out.
Yeah.
That's wild.
That, or maybe he celebrated like a Kickstarter milestone.
Yeah, and there's lots of, you can, like this kind of type of thing I think is really, I find really interesting, right? Like the stories behind some of these independent games. Like Dwarf Fortress is another one that's like just,
oh my God, Dwarf
the
Fortress.
story behind that is like they could make a movie about these guys who started Dwarf Fortress too, right? Like, and it's, their story is just, their whole story is so compelling, right? And just the fact that, all their all they want to do is work on this game because it's just a passion project, and they get to work on that passion project for a living, is, you know, really, really cool. But anyway, going back to the original question is, like, I find that, you know, why should people learn about HCI and game design? Well, it gives you all these tools so you can make really, you know, rich experiences, tell stories, understand what the people value, and start to build sort of maturity of thought around, you know, the impact of some of the decisions, the design decisions, and, you know, what mechanics might do and how they might, you know, affect people's experience.
Yeah, Vi, it kind of comes back to one of the taglines of the show of being so we can make and play better games.
Yes. Yeah, and I think one of the things we also talk about on the show is, like, how do you communicate the things you enjoy about a game, right? When you sit down and play something and you want to tell your friend that they should play it, you can't just be like, you should play this because it's so good, right? It's really helps to have that language to communicate, like, this is what I enjoyed about it, and this is what I think you would enjoy about it, and this is what makes it successful. You know, and also being able to say, well, you know, that game didn't work for me because of these reasons, and that's where we, I think, interact here. Yeah.
So as kind of another question, let's say I was someone who was starting to get interested in HCI, starting to get interested in game design, and was curious about industry, academia, and, like, is really starting to try to open up to not just the traditional go get a degree, go into industry, suffer for a little bit of trying to pick up all the tools, all the knowledge and stuff like that. If I was this person wanting to consider academia, how would I go about getting involved with in academia?
Yeah, so I mean, the best way to do that is to, you know, find a professor like me that's working in the area, and then, you know, start a conversation about it, talk about the things that you might be interested in, ask questions about what they're interested in, why they're interested in those things, right? How could they get involved, and, you know, what other opportunities might exist out there, right? It's just as easy as that, right? It is kind of like a, you know, a relationship building thing, right? The graduate studies, you know, the best graduate studies, I think, still are very much this old-fashioned apprenticeship model where it's like you know, because it would be impossible to write a complete textbook of, like, how to be a graduate student, right? It's such an open-ended area, you know, or research is so open-ended that everybody's experiences are so rich and diverse, that it's all got to be about that sort of relationship with somebody who's ultimately going to be sort of a supervisor with you, right? And so people set up those relationships, graduate supervisors set up those relationships in sort of different models. You know, I aspire to be able to spend a lot of time with my students and sort of have it sort of like a partnership where I'm just, like, you know, old and have more experience, right, working in this. But you know, and other people have different models about how to set this up, right? Maybe they set up their research lab so it's a little bit more like a startup, right? Or maybe they set up their research lab so it's more of like a sort of a team, you know, hierarchical structure where, you know, more senior graduate students help the more junior graduate students, and then, you know, maybe there's even postdoctoral fellows who finish their PhD but aren't yet professors who are helping, you know, manage things as well. And, you know, I'm kind of moving towards that way just because I'm finding you know, there's so many opportunities that not only present to me that provide rich opportunities to my students as well. So in order for us to take advantage of these, we have to sort of build our capacity a little bit. So then I say, like, oh, geez, I need help managing things. So we're starting to build in some of that, a little bit of hierarchical nature, although I always try my best to make sure that I have time to spend, like, a lot of time with individual students as they're sort of working through their graduate stage, just because, you know, there's so much to know, right? And you know, I feel like I could talk about, you know, this type of stuff for days, not just an hour.
Yeah.
So as kind of another question, really early on to the discussion, you mentioned that there's always that difficulty in communicating with industry, like between academia and industry. And I'm not going to ask you right now, how do you solve that? But instead, are you able to kind of tell us about that? Why is it difficult for industry and academia to talk with each other? Are there ways you found that might help bridge that?
Yeah. So to answer your last question, which is, have we found a way to help bridge that? I would say we haven't found a super satisfying way to do that. So I'll tell you just sort of a little, a very candid, real story, which is we started, I was, I wasn't involved in starting this at the beginning because I, was just finishing my PhD, but some of my colleagues that I've worked quite closely with started a conference called Kai Play, which was Kai I mentioned as being sort of this big, huge conference that's sort of always got international locations and people from around the world, and has quite a bit of industry involvement where there's research, especially where there's research labs, where they do a little bit more on the primary research side, and this is always sort of a philosophical thing for that company. So for example, Microsoft for the last 15 years or so have been very prominent because they have, and I actually interned there as a PhD student, worked in Seattle at Microsoft Research, and it's fabulous, right? It's like, oh, this is a great place to work, right? Everybody's, really, really, brilliant and, nice, and, there's very supportive structure for just doing interest-driven research around, not just HCI, but AI and, search technology, things that are, they try to do sort of business, quote unquote, relevant stuff. But, a lot of it is really, again, it's almost like a academic environment, right? And they participate very much in academia. Other places like, let's say, Apple are, the way that their philosophy is, they're a lot tighter and closed, right? So you see a lot, you do see some participation from Apple in academia, but not at the scale you see from Microsoft Research. Is just sort of a different philosophy there. So we started in a conference called Kai Play, and I say we because I've been involved with it since the beginning as sort of first as a role as sort of a senior reviewer, and now in the last few years I've become a member of the steering committee. So it's sort of senior members that sort of overseeing the conference is going correct, going the right direction, and taking in feedback and trying to make sure everybody's sort of on board as much as possible with the way things are going with our practices around the research we do, and involving everybody we can in research, and so this is at the Kai Play conference, right? So this is all about games and play in the HCI, and I've been the paper chair for those conferences, so overseeing sort of the technical program and people's research reports that they share through papers that they write. So long intro to sort of say that we've been thinking about this for a long time, right? We do a lot of work to bring in industry people. As I mentioned, industry people have a lot of great knowledge and practical things. Since we're very interest sort of driven in HCI in general, we often study games that people have, that exist, commercial games from AAA games to independent games as sort of artifacts. I mentioned I, did a study on Dota 2 and specifically, right? Like how do people communicate in Dota 2? Really, really common type of work to do, in addition to sort of developing our own sort of games and things like that. The questions that, and so we've always, brought people in from industry. We, for example, we had, the name of this lady escapes me, but she has a company called Kit Fox Games, and under Kit Fox Games is, they are the publishing house now for Dwarf Fortress, which we mentioned before. And so anyway, we had them come in and give a keynote talk, right? And so that sort of tie-in with industry is always really, really there, right? And we, tend to share some of our knowledge or aspire to share our knowledge with industry. But what we found is, some people do transition to industry from academia and do a little bit of back and forth, but it's kind of rare. And part of the problem is from especially for the larger AAA places, is that who actually have capacity to do R&D and to take time to sort of grab things and say, like, how can we really tweak or get the most out of this? What we find is that they say, well, it's every game is its own universe, and there's so much knowledge in that game that if I do something, like we often, design our own games to study some aspect of game design. But they said, well, that's probably not relevant to me because it's not an existing game. And we say, okay, well, great. Let us come in and we'll do whatever research you want on your game. And they're like, well, not so fast, right? This is highly proprietary.
Right.
We're not going to share our data with you. And it's like, well, and then so that leaves us kind of confused as like, okay, you want us to study, your games, but you won't give us access to the knowledge that we need to have, right? And so there's a little bit of a catch there. That's really tough to navigate. Now, and so we've worked at that a little bit, and we love to have people, especially game designers and user researchers. Game user research is a big field as well for people wanting to get into the game industry. So that's really sort of, we've built the game, we're going to study the users as they're using the game, and there's a whole industry just built around, game analytics, game data visualization. Not just the traditional sort of game designer that from the outset sort of works with the developers to design a game, but then, specific game user researchers that will bring in, pilot testers essentially, right, into a lab and they, have them sign an NDA and have them play the game and, get feedback and, have cameras on their face to actually count how many times they smile, laugh, or swear, right, and do all this sort of really rich HCI work. But it's still, we don't really get access to that. And they kind of want more contextual information, which we're sort of not exactly able to give. So it's a bit of this sort of catch-22 that we're stuck in. But, it's not to say, like, when I write a paper and I do have these conversations, oftentimes I'm surprised, like, somebody will say, oh, you're the guy that did this thing on game balancing, and I'm like, oh, you know about that, right? So it's they often know about it, but they keep it to themselves, right? And it is really rewarding though to hear and talk to them because they do have this sort of really academic, interest-driven way to think game designers do and game user researchers about how to design games and how do we understand them and things like that. So I tend to think that our work does influence them up to a certain extent. But the communication and the collaboration is not right where we as academics would really like it to be. And I guess just to finish that thought off was the thing about it is too. I was talking to somebody like somebody in the community a few weeks ago because we just had the Kai Play conference a few weeks ago, and we're like, well, we were talking about exactly this issue. How do we get working with industry more? And what the kind of we got to is like, well, maybe we don't need to, right? We're an academic discipline. We're studying this media that, this games they're bigger than Hollywood, they're bigger than publishing, they're bigger than, music industries all combined, right? And so if you take all those industries that play such a prominent role in culture, it's like why can't we just study this huge part of human the human experience without having to worry about the commercial viability of that, right? And so that was sort of, for me, as a bit of an evolution to say, like, recognizing is like, yeah, you know what? Who cares, right? Like, our research is really relevant. It's actually really important to understand, how people experience this stuff. And, that's what research should be about, right? We study interesting things, and you hope that it will have a real world impact, but if it doesn't,
you hope it's applicable in some way.
It's applicable, right? But if it doesn't, it's like, well, you studied something really interesting, and that thing that you've done, if you've done good research, is going to help somebody else do some more research, and maybe that thing that they research is going to, impact something.
It's that 2 lines at the end of the abstract where you go, this might be, applicable here, and someone should do some research on that, and somebody goes, yeah, someone should do research on that. Maybe it'll be me.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
So I think that pretty much has covered most of the questions that I've had for this. We have about another 5 minutes for the total episode. So if there's any other stories or anything interesting within the field that you wanted to get a chance to talk about throughout this episode but didn't already, this is kind of the best opportunity.
I would love to know what games you're playing right now.
That is a good question. I never actually asked what games you're playing.
So it's funny, right? I'm as if I think about, the way I played games 20 years ago, it was very much more probably like, oh, this new AAA game's coming out, I'm going to be like, get it and play it and that sort of thing. And my, behavior as my time, has changed, having, kids and having pretty busy career, means that, I've shifted the way that I play games, right? So when I do play AAA games, I often find now it's like, oh, it's that, thing from 5 years ago that has shown to be really, really influential, right? And those are the games that I start to play with. And the problem for me is that, I get pretty engaged with things, right? So then I find myself finding time to do this. And it's like, okay, well, the only time I actually have is like those couple hours after midnight, right? And that's not a healthy thing for me, especially as I get older. So the games that I play now tend to be, stuff that I can play with my kids that they'll play with me. So we've been playing, one thing is, Mario Kart, right, on the Switch, just because everybody can play it, right? Everybody likes it, and
the accessibility
like
thing again.
It's a little bit about the accessibility, right? And especially, Mario Kart now, right, has all those things, and we've done, I talked about game balancing and target shooting and things like that, but we actually did follow-up studies that was looking at, that same sort of game balancing in the context of driving, right? And so one of the things that we did was auto steer and different assistance with, speed and things like that. Some of that stuff existed in Mario Kart, but now it's very prominent, right? Like even when you start playing Mario Kart now, you have to actually go in and turn off the auto steer.
Every time I launch this game, I'm like, player 2, turn off auto steering. You don't need it. You've played the game before.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so then it's a little bit of an argument in our family because everybody's kind of played enough now. Is like, who's going to turn off auto steer, right?
Yeah.
Like he's like, I think you're ready to turn off the auto steer now. It's like, and I think also, if you've played enough too, right? Like I can't play with the auto steer. I'm like, it's super annoying, right?
Pulls you right off the shortcuts.
Yeah, exactly, right. So Mario Kart, and I was saying like myself, right? I played Stardew Valley, right? I used to play Civilization 5, right? And I had to stop that because I'm a big
After 700 hours, I did too.
Yeah. I don't think I reached 700, but
that's so many hours, guys.
Yeah.
740 in Civ 5, 860 in Civ 6.
That's too many.
Wow.
Yeah. But this was like back mostly when I was in high school and like first year university when my schedules weren't too packed.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do that anymore. I've put those games away.
Yeah. And so yeah, I like so games like Civilization I have to like steer clear of, right? Like I bought Civilization 6 when it came out, whenever that was, like 5 years ago or something, like as soon as it came out. And I was like, no, I just turned it on. I was like, this doesn't look like Civilization 5. And I don't want to learn some new mechanics and things like that. And that was enough to sort of like not let me do it. But then, of course, in the summer, this summer, actually, I turned it on. It was like, I played one night. It was like 10 o'clock, and I was like, oh, I have a little bit of time. I'm going to play. I've never tried it. I'm going to try it. I was like, and then I looked at my watch, and I was like, oh, crap, it's 2 a.m., right?
Yep.
How did this happen?
That's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah.
I picked it up near launch, and I was like, oh, I don't like the new mechanics, and put it away.
Yeah.
And came back a few years later, and I'm like, wait, it's moddable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, and the other one that we were talking about a little bit earlier was, before we started recording, was Stardew Valley, right? And that one is kind of currently eating up my time, and I made a mistake actually when I was going to the conference, I was like, oh, I should, gotta get my mind into relaxing and thinking about games again. I'm going to play Stardew Valley on my phone, right? And it's just like, holy crap, right now it's like, oh my gosh.
The biggest mistake.
Yeah,
playing Stardew Valley on mobile.
I've found like 40 hours that I didn't actually have to play this in the last month or so, right?
Yeah.
And so those are the games that I'm playing, right? And so it's a lot of in the games and so last night my youngest son who's 10 saw me playing Stardew Valley so much he's like, oh, I was like, well, you want to play a game tonight, right? So it was last night. He's like, oh, can we play Stardew Valley together? I'm like, yes, we can, right?
Oh,
so
that's
we
so
did,
good.
and I set up a projector now, right? So we were playing Stardew Valley on split screen. And it was super fun, right? Like,
oh, that's awesome.
It was nice.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Looking at my Stardew hours at 5:50.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's my summertime game.
Yeah.
So we're just about reaching the time. So I have one final question for you. If people who've listened to the show would like to reach out to you at any point, is there anywhere where they can learn more about you or possibly contact you?
Yeah. So probably the easiest thing that I can do to get a hold of me, you can go to my website, which I have several websites for the different, like we have one for the HCI lab, we have one for Spectral, but I have my own personal website, which is kind of up to date. It's probably a year out of date, which for a professor is really, really good. So it's just scottbateman.ca, and you can go there, and then you can sort of navigate to all my things, or you can contact me that way. And also you can see, like, I've got a listing of all our papers and stuff like that. We do have somewhere like a YouTube channel as well, where, you know, increasingly most of our research presentations we actually record, since the pandemic especially. So we've got like YouTube videos up of a full, like, you know, 10-minute, you know, encapsulation of some of our recent research projects. But we also have sort of shorter, like 2 or 3 minute vignettes of some of our research as well. So you can go and check that out as well. Yeah, and so I'm always happy to chat with anybody who wants to talk about this stuff. As you can see, I can ramble pretty good.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and for being part of this episode of The Art of Play. I think that covers everything. So I've been Gaia.
And I've been Vi.
And we'll see you next time. And that's it for today's episode. But what if you wanted to listen to more? Well, our new episodes come out every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic, and there are 3 different ways that you can listen. If you're in the Fredericton area of New Brunswick, Canada, you can listen live on CHSR 97.9 FM through any of your radio services. If you're not in this region or you prefer using the internet, you can tune in on chsrfm.ca at the same time, 9 p.m. Atlantic. As well, we release all of our episodes on a number of podcasting platforms online, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. So if you wanted to, you could go back right now and listen to Season 1, where Vi and I do a deep dive into the fundamental concepts of game design, rather than the hardware they'll be taking up this season. Anyways, thank you for listening, and have a good one.